Welcome to the module on monetary management in an open economy. In this module, firstly we discuss about the classification of the economies as closed versus open. So in terms of the closed economy, it is basically not interacting with the rest of the world where the policies are always restrictive and protective, and it is against export promotion or any kind of openness. But in case of open economy, it interacts freely with the rest of the world, which all forces of globalization, export promotion are in it. Next, we move on to the concept of flows of goods and services. When we discuss the flows of goods and services, the first concept that comes in the exports. So exports are basically considered domestically produced goods and services, but they are sold abroad. Imports are basically produced in the foreign country but sold domestically, because that is how we can go for a balance of trade, which calls for the net balance between export and import. Then we have the concept of trade balance, which gives by the values of export minus the value of import. This has different names like current account surplus or current account balance or even trade balance. So it is said that if the value of export is basically greater than the value of imports, then we have the trade surplus. Otherwise, we are having the trade deficit, which can also account for current account surplus or current account deficit. So now we can invite a question on the concept of export and import as definition of export and import, where it is being said that export is basically referring to those which are sold abroad, and imports are basically foreign goods sold domestically. Now we move on to the concept of the variables that are influencing the net exports. Because what are the determinants of the net exports in an economy? Firstly, we have the consumer preferences for foreign and domestic goods. So in any globalized economy, the consumers are exposed to capital market as well as the domestic market and output market across the globe. So their exposure to foreign market comes in, so they can purchase any item from abroad as well as from the domestic market. Secondly, the prices of goods at home and abroad. This is basically referring to the comparison of the international price with that of the domestic price. So it is said that the imported goods may be of superior quality, which can have some cost advantage, and so it is demanded, and thereby the concept of exports come in. And prices of the goods at home and abroad also is important to sell it off, because the domestic output can be sold at abroad if the revenue or the return is higher than it in the domestic country. Second, the incomes of consumers at home and abroad. This is also very much important because of the income of the consumers, which is considered as the index of purchasing power. Next, we have the exchange rate, which is also important for the currency, because whenever we are participating in export and import, the currency depreciation and appreciation matters. So it is said that if the exchange rate basically depreciates, then the domestic currency becomes basically more costlier and foreign currency becomes cheaper, and thereby it basically makes export to be cheaper. So this also refers to the exchange rate, but fluctuations are important. And transportation cost also plays an important role in terms of the shipment of the goods and services. Government policies also has a remarkable role on the net export, because government sometimes provides some incentives to the exporters. Sometimes it imposes cost on the imports, like in case of tax on imports, and want to motivate and encourage more of exports. So this boils down to the concept of trade surplus and trade deficit. So when we go for the trade surplus or trade deficit, the first concept comes as NX, which is basically the net export, which measures the imbalance in the country's trade in goods and services. Imbalance in the sense that export may exceed the import. So trade deficit is actually the opposite of that, where NX becomes less than 0, where excess of import over export, and trade surplus is basically given by excess of export over import as it is given. However, whenever the country practices balanced trade, which may be hypothetical, where the value of export and value of import are identical. So thereby we invite a question on define trade deficit and surplus, whereby trade deficit we mean that import is exceeding the export, and by trade surplus we mean that export is exceeding the import, and thereby we can see balance of trade either balances itself in terms of the external market. Now we move on to the concept of flow of capital. Because in terms of monetary management, the most important concept in an open economy, how the capital flows and how the monetary economics or the monetary authorities will respond to that. Firstly, we consider the concept of net capital outflow because these are very much related with international trade and also with the functioning of the monetary authorities. By net capital outflow, we mean domestic residents are purchasing of foreign assets minus foreign purchase of domestic asset. That means whenever an Indian is purchasing any foreign asset, that is basically considered as outflow because they have to pay the foreign exchange minus the foreigners purchasing an Indian good, which is basically an entry or influx of foreign exchange in India. So this is basically considered as net capital outflow. In the same way, we can see that another name of this NCO or net capital outflow is net foreign investment. Because net foreign investment is very much in tune with the capital flows that take place. Moreover, we can see that the flow of the capital abroad takes of two forms. Foreign direct investment, which is basically dealt in the monetary management, like domestic residents manage the foreign investment, like McDonald's opens a fast food outlet in Moscow. So the domestic residents are basically employed and they are earning their livelihoods from these MNCs, and that is how the flow of capital takes place. And another one can be foreign portfolio investment, where the domestic residents purchase foreign stocks or bonds supplying loanable funds to foreign firm. That means in case of this, it is said that any kind of fund raised by the domestic country at abroad is basically earning the returns in terms of foreign portfolio investment. So portfolio diversification is being done, and then we have the foreign direct investment as it is being said. So capital abroad takes place of two forms, one is direct and one is portfolio. Apart from this, we are having the net capital outflow in terms of positive or negative. So when NCF is greater than 0, then domestic purchase of foreign asset exceed the foreign purchase of domestic asset. This is very much good for a nation in terms of the macro stability. Because here it says that if India wants to invest in the foreign country, then obviously Indian purchase of foreign asset, which actually brings in foreign exchange, is greater than that of the foreigners who are operating within India. So if the foreigners operating within India are basically sending their remittances to their home country, so in that case, net capital outflow positive is always giving a momentum to the nation or to the country in terms of macroeconomic stability, and so it is considered to be positive. On the other hand, negative means that foreign purchase of domestic assets. If the domestic assets are gradually taken over by the MNCs, then basically the outflow will be more, and in terms of this, the foreign exchange has to be drained out rather than domestic purchase of the foreign asset. So there can be two possibilities, either the net capital outflow is positive or net capital outflow is negative. So in either of these cases, capital outflow either will refer to the outward or the leakage of foreign exchange, and when it is negative, then capital inflow comes in. So here it is very important to understand the concept, because when NCO is greater than 0, then we call capital outflow, and when NCO is less than 0, we call capital inflow. So NCO less than 0 means inflow of capital takes place, where the signs are important, but the concepts have to be understood in details in terms of outflow and inflow concept. So this brings us to the discussions on what are the variables that influence net capital outflow. The first one is real interest rate paid on the foreign asset. This is basically referring to the different types of interest rate which can be paid. So in terms of the foreign asset, if the international rate of interest appears to be less in terms of borrowing or appears to be more in terms of lending, then that will be preferred. So always a domestic interest rate is compared with the international rate of interest and in real terms. Here real terms takes care for adjustment with the exchange rate. So real interest rate paid on the domestic asset. This is also one of the variable, because this also takes care of the domestic interest rate, whether it is more or less, or whether it will motivate international borrowing or international lending. Then we have the perceived risk of holding foreign asset. These risks are associated with a risk of defaulter or the risk of fraud in a world of technology. So any such kind of foreign asset holding can also lead to governance issue, and thereby net capital outflow can be affected. Either because of any kind of mismanagement, there can be more outflow of foreign exchange, and thereby the country has to suffer the loss. Then we have the government policies affecting the foreign ownership of domestic assets. This is very much important because when we talk about the government policy, how the domestic asset ownership can be taken up. This basically refers to different policies like tax concessions, different policies like infrastructural benefits, or even tax and subsidy imposed on the foreign counterparts. So now we invite a question on explain the variables that influence NCO. So this basically refers to the interest rate, basically refers to the domestic rates and other variables which are in process. Now we move on to the most important concept of monetary management in an open economy is the equality of net exports and net capital outflow. Because this goes back to the Mundell-Fleming model, how the net capital outflow and net export can be equated or can have an equilibrium. The first concept comes in an accounting identity where it says that net capital outflow is equal to net export, because by net capital outflow we say that it can be positive or it can be negative. So if NX is positive means export is exceeding the import, which means that it is making NCO to be negative because of foreign capital inflows. This boils down to the concept of why it is called an accounting identity, because every transaction that affects net export also affects net capital outflow by the same amount. This transaction refers to international transaction or global transaction. So it is affecting the net exports, it's also affecting the net capital outflow. This net capital outflow is very much important because it refers to the capital which is invested abroad or any kind of return which is generated from the resources. Then we have the concept of an example, that is when a foreigner purchases a good from the US. Then US export and the net exports increase. Definitely it is being said that suppose a foreigner is visiting Agra and taking a meal. So whenever a foreigner takes an Indian meal, definitely India earns a foreign exchange out of it. So thereby net exports rises in terms of services. At the same time, foreigners pays with the currency or asset. So US acquires some foreign assets, causing net capital outflow also to rise. So it both ways are basically interdependent. So whenever a foreigner purchases a good, definitely it is an export, and thereby net exports increase because this is in terms of the physical good or the visible item that takes place. So purchasing a good means a physical item takes place. In terms of that, a domestic item is being exported. At the same time, whenever the foreigner, in order to purchase, pays in the currency, say in dollars, this also adds on the net capital outflow. So both ways the country is benefited, so the equality is very much in place in terms of net capital outflow and net exports. Secondly, we can see that when a US citizen buys foreign goods, then what happens? US imports, because India purchasing any US good, for example, it is an importing a good. So in this example, when a US citizen buys foreign goods, then US imports is on the rise. So as a result of that, we have to pay, or US has to pay by giving foreign exchange or dollars. So thereby net export falls because import comes up here. At the same time, whenever it is buying in the dollars, so other countries acquiring the asset, so US net capital outflow falls. So that means when NX is on the fall, then NCO also is on the fall. That is from the import side. Because whenever the US buyer pays with US dollars, definitely the other country acquires the asset, causing the net capital outflow also to fall. So always from both the dimensions, NCO and NX always go together. So this boils down to the concept of how the international flows of goods and asset are linked up with saving and investment. So as we can see, Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX, where Y refers to the total output, C refers to the final consumption expenditure of the household sector, I refers to investment of the firms, G refers to government spending, and NX refers to the net export. So by rearranging the terms, we can get Y minus C minus G is equal to I plus NX. In the next term, as we can see, this is the total income, and C and G, that is consumption and government, are the expenses. So income minus expenditure gives the concept of saving, which is S. So this S becomes equals to I plus NX. Because it's an open economy, we have an added component which is net export. And so we can see in terms of NX, we can replace it by NCO, which comes under the same ideology that NX and NCO are the same. And thereby we can see that when saving is greater than investment, then the excess funds flow abroad in terms of positive net capital outflow. Because if S is greater than I, then what does it mean? It means that within the domestic economy, there are remaining some investable surpluses. So the total amount of savings is not invested domestically. There is a surplus of the savings which can be domestic or which can be invested at abroad and which can contribute to foreign exchange, because that is how NCO can be positive. On the other hand, if S is less than I, this basically appears mostly in an economy when the saving potentials are less but investment projections are always high. So by that point of time, country import in order to finance the investment. So foreigners are financing some of the country's investment and NCO becomes negative. Because the country's domestic investment are being financed by inviting to MNC, by inviting foreign direct investment and many other foreign players. This happens in Indian economy where in order to finance the domestic investment, we require foreign capital, and that boils down to NCO less than 0. So this basically refers to the concept of exchange rate as it comes in. Because without exchange rate, the discussions of exchange rate and NX and NCO remains incomplete. So exchange rate can be of two types, nominal and real. The first one is the nominal, where one country trades with other without taking care of any kind of adjustments. So when we express the exchange rate as foreign currency per unit of domestic currency, that we can say the nominal exchange rate. So we can see some of the exchange rate are followed after the economic liberalization took place in the world economy in 2008. That's why the year is marked on. Now in terms of the other movements of this exchange rate, we have appreciation and depreciation. Appreciation means the value of the currency measured by the amount of foreign currency it can buy. So appreciation of dollar means the value of the dollar is on the rise. So any item which is purchased in terms of dollar, they will be benefited. But in depreciation, the value of the currency as measured by the amount of foreign currency it can buy. That means the foreign exchange of the dollar becomes cheaper, and as a result of that, depreciation becomes weakening of the currency, and appreciation refers to strengthening of the currency. So it is being said some of the examples of depreciation of US dollar against euro and appreciation against South Korean currency. Another concept of exchange rate boils down to real exchange rate. So what we mean by the real, where the rate at which goods and services of one country trade for the goods and services of another. So it is basically given by E, which is the nominal exchange rate, into domestic price by P star. So where P is the domestic price which is prevalent within the economy, P star is the foreign price, that is the foreign currency, and E is the nominal exchange rate. So we can see how the nominal exchange rate is dependent upon the relative measure of price, which is the domestic price divided by the international price. So similarly, we can see an example of a Big Mac costs $2.50 in US and 400 yen in Japan. So the exchange rate is given by 120 yen per dollar. So we can find out the E into P, which comes up as 300. And we compute the real exchange rate just by 300 divided by the 400. That is the rate at which the nominal exchange rate can be traded, and there is a ratio which is being taken up between the domestic price and the international price. So this boils down to 0.75 Japanese big that comes in. Now we move on to the concept of interpreting the real exchange rate. So when we go for interpretation, then the real exchange rate comes up as 0.75, and so we can interpret that whenever we interpret for an US economy, a Japanese citizen must sacrifice an amount that could purchase 0.75 Big Macs in Japan. That means the sacrifice that will be made by the Japan in order to purchase an US item is measured in terms of their currency, which must be foregone to purchase 1 unit of the dollar or the US currency. So this can be done also with many goods, like we can see in terms of the consumer price index, where we can encounter a large number of items over a basket of the goods. So the formula remains the same, but not for a single item, but for the basket of the goods it can be done. So moreover, we can see appreciation and depreciation of the currency. So in terms of every world economy, we operate on the concept of law of one price. That means when we go for law of one price, we're bringing the concept of monetary management in terms of purchasing power parity. That means goods should be sold for the same price in all markets, where a coffee sells $4 per pound in Seattle and $5 per pound in Boston, which can be costlessly transported. That is how comes in the concept of arbitrage, or comes in the concept of selling quick profit, and thereby one law or law of one price holds in. So that is how arbitrage plays an important role. So this boils down to the concept of purchasing power parity. So what is that? A theory of exchange rates where unit of a currency should be able to buy same quantity of goods in all countries. So purchasing power parity means in terms of the quantity to be purchased, that should be same when the exchange rates are equalized or there is a parity between them. So based on the law of one price, when the nominal exchange rate equalized to the price of the basket across the countries, that is where the equalization takes place. This also boils down to the price that comes in, and thereby we can see E into P is equal to P star. As we said that this is the price of US Big Mac in yen, and this is the price of Japanese Big Mac in yen. So we can see how the equalization takes place by purchasing power parity just in terms of the real exchange rate. That is E into P is equal to the P star. And thereby the volume of the quantities will be produced or will be consumed will be same for every unit of the currency that is being done. So that is we solve for E and we get the ratio of these prices. So we can see that purchasing power parity means nominal exchange rates are being compared equal at all the places. If two countries have different inflation rates, then this exchange rate will take over, and thereby the international price will rise faster. So dollar will also appreciate, and thereby the movement will take up. In the same manner, inflation will be higher, and then also the appreciation will take place in the same manner. So we can see some of the limitations are there, like goods cannot be easily traded. Examples like haircuts, going to movies, it cannot be easy to measure this in one price, where the one price notion fails. Price arbitrage can come in, whereby the middlemen or the lenders can come up and they can sell off in between the currency, which needs to be monitored. Foreign domestic goods are not perfect substitutes. It may happen that they are not substitutes to each other, so law of one price may not prevail. Like US consumers prefer Toyotas over Chevys or vice versa. And price differences also reflect taste differences. This is also important because of a taste or the ethnicity of a country, they are not going to follow the same suit. So moreover, we can see that in case of the long run trends, purchasing power parity works well, because when we go for comparison in the macro indicators across nations, this is what we do. Like inflation rate and the exchange rate, we want to take control. And similarly, the data comes in. So in this particular module, we are basically referring to monetary management in terms of the concept of exports, how the imports develop. Then we have the monetary management in terms of the purchasing power parity theory, how the equalization of exchange rate will take place, and how the law of one price will prevail. And we can also explain the concept of limitations that comes in. Moreover, any kind of economy can manage the foreign exchange provided a sound financial system which can take care of the fluctuations in the exchange rate mechanisms.